In a journey through spiritual song, it's sometimes difficult to tell the difference between heavenly music and more down-to-earth melodies. The Morriston Tabernacle is a Welsh temple of music, and for over 100 years the Morriston Orpheus Choir has filled it with their singing. This music may sound like a song of praise, but in fact it was written for the theatre 300 years ago by a composer who understood that song, whether sacred or secular, can lift the human heart to heaven.
When we're singing, we have various emotions. Let's take, for instance, sound and alarm. We all feel that there is something really special about music like that. There's something really uplifting. There's an exhilaration. It's almost a spiritual uplift, one might say.
The sound of the Orpheus is so distinctive that I think anyone who stands on the stage and hears that sound really becomes filled with some sort of Welsh emotion. It's one which fills the heart.
We travel throughout the world, and wherever we go, we seem to build bridges with people through the medium of song, and I think that's a wonderful thing to do in life.
Singing gives us a lot, but yes, you know, when you travel around the world, you know, people really love to hear you and see you, and we're ambassadors for Wales, yes.
The thrill of being in a choir is a strong Welsh passion, and Ruth Maddock has felt the influence of her childhood in Morriston throughout her singing and acting career.
Well, I truly believe that because of the chapels and because of the churches that cottoned on very quickly, you know, to community singing and the wonderful vibration that you can get in community singing. And this is why we have such wonderful choirs still in Wales, although now a lot of them aren't attached to chapels or churches. But, for instance, the Morriston Male Voice Choir, they always were attached to the Tabernacle, a marvellous, great big chapel in Morriston. And it was this togetherness, the singing together. I think they could have been singing My Old Man's a Dustman. It wouldn't have really mattered. But it happened to be a little bit of Haydn or Handel or Purcell, and it was wonderful.
It's hard to imagine now, when the music of composers like Haydn, Handel and Purcell is available to everyone, that 300 years ago, only the most exclusive of audiences could enjoy their work. In the 17th century, this was one of the few places where elaborate church music was being performed, the Royal Palace of St James in London. In order to hear the work of the finest composers, you had to be well in with the king. He had exclusive rights over their compositions. Music, especially church music, wasn't for the plebs. The monarch employed the cream of composers and singers to perform for the court church, known as the Chapel Royal. The chapel wasn't actually housed in one place. It was the musical circus that followed the king around the country and abroad, providing right royal entertainment. The boys of the Chapel Royal, dressed in their royal livery, were literally press-ganged into the king's service, stolen from choirs up and down the country, taken to London, and then dumped unceremoniously when their voices broke. Life isn't so tough for today's choristers, but twice a month they still have to sing for their supper in front of members of the royal family. The roll call of composers at the Chapel Royal, chosen to provide the kings and queens of England with inspiration, reads like a who's who of great British church musicians. Apart from George Frederick Handel and Henry Purcell, there was Thomas Tallis, Orlando Gibbons and Robert Fairfax. They all wrote and played for this very special royal chapel, meeting the exciting musical challenges that shaped all church music to come. The Chapel Royal was a musical hothouse, bringing out the talents of the best musicians. Backed by the limitless purse of the monarch and enjoying frequent trips to Europe, they were the musical elite. The only limitation to their work was that it had to appeal to the king, and it had to suit the ambience of the royal church. Solemn anthems like that were the only music that some composers would write for the church. But King Charles II had other ideas. He'd spent some time in France at the court of Louis XIV, and there he'd learned to enjoy a rather more theatrical style of singing. "That's what I want in my Chapel Royal," he said. So when he got back to London, the king formed a string orchestra of 24 players and said to his composers, "Now write me some anthems which include the strings, not just to accompany the singers, but also to have little interludes of their own." Opinion in the chapel was divided. There were some who said, "Wonderful new sounds," whilst others said, "Absolute rubbish, more suited to the tavern than the church." But the king got his way. And what a good thing he did. Liberated from the stuffiness of traditional music, the most enterprising composers headed straight to Theatreland to find the best venues to showcase their ambitious new work. George Frederick Handel, the Andrew Lloyd Webber of his day, wrote his mighty work Messiah for just such a theatrical performance. Thanks to a king's desire to keep up with the new music scene on the continent, the crossover between sacred and secular had been bridged, a link which continues today.
Ruth, what's the difference between singing in church and singing on the stage?
Well, I think very little, because both is giving. And when I was a child, I learned about music in a chapel or a church. So for me, music means giving of yourself, of your soul, really. And when I am in a church singing, whether it's in a congregation or solo, then you have to give. It's just the same. On a stage, you project. And of course, I started singing when we didn't have microphones as well, which was another thing. And you had to project your organ, as it were, out to the congregation or the audience. So for me, it was very, very little in the difference. You were just singing either a song from a show, or you could have been singing O Divine Redeemer.
The crossover between sacred and secular music allowed London's 17th century theatregoers to enjoy some of the hottest hits in town. It also made the church realise that it needed to liven up its musical act.
And it was left to Henry Purcell to show us that there's a lot more cheerfulness in church music than you might imagine, particularly when it comes to setting words like rejoice in the Lord always. And even just one word like hallelujah.
Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
Purcell was the genius amongst an amazingly talented group of boys who came to the Chapel Royal soon after 1660. He was only to live for 36 years, but he became organist of the chapel and also of Westminster Abbey, and throughout his life he wrote the most exquisite music, both for the church and the theatre.
It's very nice to be able to sit in a theatre or a pretty garden such as this and be serenaded by the music of Henry Purcell. But people who went to church at the end of the 17th century wanted something more. They wanted their own music to sing. So join me next week for the great hymn singing explosion and the wonderful words of Isaac Watts and John and Charles Wesley.